episode of the G&D Media podcast. We're speaking to Brett Christophers about his new book, The Price is Wrong, Why Capitalism Won't Save the Planet. And the book is all about the energy sector and why it's very complicated and not very well put together, to put it bluntly. Brett is an absolute master of knowledge on this field. It's very complicated, but he explains it very easily. We kind of talk about the origins of the energy sector in the UK and how it became apparent. Spoiler alert, about privatisation being rubbish. We talk about why energy companies aren't incentivised to go green, and also what we could do to fix it. It's a really interesting chat. Me and Lucy had a great time, and we're going to have to bring him back because there's so much we didn't cover in this. You should just certainly go out and get it. And yeah, enjoy the show. Good morning, good afternoon, good night. You're listening to G&D Media. I am your host and producer, Andrew Glassford, and as ever, I'm joined by one of the most esteemed trade unionists in the Greater Manchester area. It's Lucy Burke. Lucy, how are you?
I am fine. A bit rushed off my feet right now for various reasons, but yes, very, very well. Not particularly esteemed, I don't think, but doing my best.
Well, hopefully we can provide some steam during this conversation.
Yeah,
you'll feel more esteemed by the end of it. We're going to crack on because we've got a big topic to kind of get our head into today, which is about the energy sector. And I think, well, I thought myself, didn't realise how little I knew about it until I started reading Brett's book today. So let's crack on. If there's any one word that is synonymous with tackling climate change, it's electrification. Yes, getting off fossil fuels and taking the majority of the CO2 out of our economy are the goals of many working on climate, but if there was one silver bullet for the climate movement, it's generating more clean electricity. Now, in the UK, electricity makes up roughly 18% of our energy consumption. The rest is gas to heat our homes and petrol and diesel for our vehicles and machinery. You'll have heard great news stories over the last couple of years where Britain runs on 100% renewables for 17 hours, or even heard that 50% of electricity comes from renewable sources itself. It's important to remember, though, 50% of 18% of total energy is not quite as impressive as it seems. And to move the other 82% of energy onto the electricity grid is going to be quite the task. But the technology, for the most part, is already there. Renewable forms of energy have been around for a long time. Windmills date back to 700 AD. Granted, they were to mill wheat as opposed to like electricity, but the principle is still the same. And the first solar panels have been around since the 1880s. Battery storage solutions have come on leaps and bounds in the last 20 years, and in the UK there are several companies that just buy electricity from the grid to sell it later at a higher price. The cost of installing renewables as well, like solar and wind, has gotten cheaper and cheaper over this time. So I would say the fundamentals of going full electric must be in place. Our question today is, why aren't we there yet? Today we're joined by, and you already just saw him, is Brett Christopher. Brett is a political economist and economic geographer and has just published his new book, The Price is Wrong, Why Capitalism Won't Save the Planet, on Verso books. Brett, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be with you.
It's an absolute pleasure. So I want to kind of get started first by tackling your job description, because I've never heard of an economic geographer. And so for my sins, please tell me what that means to start with.
Yeah, that's a good... geography, or I guess human geography, which is the as opposed to physical geography, which is kind of where I'm based and have always worked. It's a bit of an odd beast. It's kind of a melange of all sorts of different disciplines with a focus on the spatial and the geographical. And you get geographers who are focused on kind of historical questions, geographers who are focused on social, cultural questions, and then geographers like me that are focused on predominantly on economic questions. So I guess an economic geographer is a geographer who pretends to be something of an economist. Is probably the best way I can put it.
I see. Someone thought it was worthwhile understanding how production affects geography. I suppose in a way of putting
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. Fair enough. Well, it's good to know. Could you tell us a little bit more about your background and kind of your career trajectory and how you got interested in, like, I suppose, the environment, and then like the energy transition?
Yeah, so I've not always been like a career academic.
Mm-hmm.
I've spent most of my career in academia, but I did have a relatively formative period between my master's and my PhD, where I worked for 7 or 8 years essentially in the consulting business, strategy consulting, when I was based in London. And I say it was formative because it kind of working within the belly of the beast, so to speak. I learned most of what I've subsequently most of the fundamentals of which I've subsequently been writing about when I write about kind of contemporary capitalism. To my mind, it kind of helps to have worked in the capitalist world and kind of figured out from the inside rather than the outside how things actually work. But for the last, getting on for 20 years, I've been in academia. I've done a series of books now with Verso that have looked at, I guess, various aspects of contemporary capitalism, with a particular focus on changing patterns of asset ownership. One of the key types of major infrastructure assets these days are green infrastructures versus brown infrastructures. And so I guess the work I've been doing with Verso over the years essentially kind of increasingly led in this direction. Mm-hmm. And the book that we're going to talk about today is I mean, as much as anything else, it's an attempt to kind of solve what struck me as a bit of a puzzle, which was that on the one hand, as you already hinted, it's well known that the cost of generating electricity through solar and wind has come down dramatically, particularly over the last 15 years or so. Yeah. And yet at the same time, it's patently clear that renewables are not growing fast enough to even really make a dent yet in the amount of electricity generated from fossil fuels, which is still increasing. So I guess I was trying to answer that apparent puzzle in the book. And as you also already hinted at, the answer is actually very, very complex, because electricity is very, very complex as a business, as well as a kind of engineering physical phenomenon.
Well, let's kind of get into that a bit, actually. So it's for the folks at home who may not know much about electricity at all or how it's generated. If to do it in a northern way, if I put my kettle in my house to make a cup of tea, how many organisations are involved in that, from the power at the station to me flicking that switch?
So yeah, that's a very good place to start. And I say that because, and I think this is one of the main themes of the book, I suppose, is that and the argument I make is that it's literally impossible to understand the recent history and prospects for decarbonisation of electricity production unless you pay extremely close attention to how the business of electricity production and distribution is organised. And it gets complicated precisely because it looks different from country to country. And even in a place like the US, for example, it looks different from region to region. So you have completely different industry structures in different regions. And the ability and desire and capacity of those industries to transition towards renewables is utterly dependent upon what that industry looks like, how it's structured. So in terms of your question, the simple answer is that, and this is a very kind of simplified answer, but historically, by which I mean from mid-20th century through to kind of the 1980s, in most parts of the world, it was a very simple system whereby the answer to your question was typically one, by which I mean there would be one organisation, which in the UK's case was the Central Electricity Generating Board, which essentially did all of it. It produced the electricity, and it controlled, owned, and managed the vast bulk of the physical infrastructures through which that electricity was delivered from where it was generated to the homes and businesses where it got consumed. Now, and that was broadly true in most countries of the world. Again, big generalization, but bear with me. And in a country like the UK, that was one entity because the UK is not very big. In other parts of the world, it would be a different entity in different regions of the country, for example, in the US. And so that was what was referred to as a vertically integrated model. So the distribution chain was integrated from generation all the way through transmission and distribution. Now, what has typically happened across large parts of the world, not all of the world, but large parts of the world, particularly what we think of as the global north, but not only there, that supply chain has been vertically disintegrated over time, by which I mean that the different components, which are principally generation, so producing the power, transmission, which is the kind of long distance delivery at high voltages, and then the distribution, which is the local distribution to homes and businesses, have become unbundled, so separated into different business. And there are all sorts of reasons why that's happened. A lot of it's about trying to open the system to private ownership. Remember, and again, another important part of this is that those vertically integrated operators were typically publicly owned, as in the case of the UK. Increasingly, the industry has been privatized, and partly to enable privatization and to enable different forms of competition within privatized industries, that industry has been unbundled over time. And again, to different degrees and in different ways in different parts of the world. So today in the UK, it would likely be 2, 3, even 4 different entities that are involved in that chain. So sometimes it will be the same company that owns the generating assets that will also be the company that you relate to as a consumer. But typically it won't be. So typically the retailers, the sellers of the electricity to homes and businesses today, are not the businesses that are also producing the power. It's different entities that are involved.
Can you say a bit more about how uneven this is, say, even within, say, Europe? Because it was really interesting. We chatted to Hazel Nolan, who is a GMB regional officer, and she was talking about the fact that the city of Munich owns more of the wind energy produced in Scotland than people in Scotland do. And it was this kind of
right.
I think sort of explaining this the kind of how this works and perhaps the uneven nature of it would be really, really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, it does look it does look different around the world and even within Europe. In general, Europe is probably the most how can I put it, liberalized of electricity markets, for want of a better word. It's gone more and further down that road of unbundling, privatizing, introducing competition than other parts of the world. But there are two things I would say to kind of, I guess, caveat that. One is that the rest of the world, to the extent that you can discern a trend, is increasingly heading in the European direction. So heading towards European type electricity sectors. So more competition, more unbundling, more privatization. Even in places like China, I would say that's true, although it's not there yet. The second caveat is that, as you say, even within Europe, it's very, very uneven. So a country like France, for example, looks completely different to a country like the UK. So in the UK, there are multiple significant generators of electrical power. In France, it's predominantly EDF, which is still a publicly owned enterprise. And again, the mix of fuel sources is very, very different geographically as well. So in France, it's predominantly nuclear, whereas where I live in Sweden, it's predominantly hydro, nuclear and wind are each about 30% of electricity generation, and the other 10% is predominantly natural gas. So it's all completely uneven around the world in terms of who the actors are, what the energy sources are, and how the industry is structured. And so the book is an attempt both to recognize and respect that heterogeneity, but also extract and discern some common trends from out of that kind of overall mess.
So turning to the book then, which is here's the product placement, the price is wrong, why capitalism won't save the planet. I would say that the crux of your argument in this is that the reason why we're not getting enough renewable generation is because it's not worth it to capitalists right now. And
yes.
Even though the case is that, like, for example, solar has fallen in price by about 60% since the 2000s, and you write about this in the book, that actually that cheapness may be having a negative effect on investment in solar, which is probably wild to most people to think that you would assume that a capitalist or any investor would want the goods they're buying to sell to be as cheap as possible, so then they could, extract as much profit out of it as they can. Now, as we've kind of discerned that the energy market is a bit of a complex beast, so why are all these things out of sync? Like, why can you not generate enough profit out of something which is so fundamental to how capitalism works now already, with the energy demand being so high? What I suppose, to answer your book, why is the price wrong, Brett?
Yeah. So unfortunately, there is not a simple answer, which you'll know from having read the book. And what I mean by that is that there are lots of reasons why, and lots of interlocking reasons why one might think would be the case, which, as you say, is that as the cost of producing a commodity, electricity, goes down through, for example, progression in the development of solar and wind technologies, that the capitalist interest in producing that product for sale goes up because of in terms of expected profits. And there, as I said, there are lots of reasons why that's not the case. And I guess what would be most useful is to discuss with you guys what some of the main reasons for that are. So that's what I do. I guess the place to start is to back up a little bit, which is to say, why is a lack of profits, which, as you say, is the kind of fundamental argument of the book, a problem? And the problem is this, right? Which is that in most parts of the world, and there are exceptions to this. China's a significant, if partial, exception, but in most parts of the world, governments, the strategy of governments towards driving the energy transition, moving us towards renewables and away from fossil fuels, has been to put the onus on the private sector and on markets. They've essentially said, we are not going to do this themselves. We are relying on you, the private sector, to build all the solar and wind farms we need, to run them, to operate them, to sell the electricity, and so on and so forth. Rather than governments, either using their own financial resources or borrowing to do so, building those infrastructures themselves, owning the assets, and running the renewables businesses themselves. Governments are typically not doing that. It's not public ownership. Is not what the chosen strategy. They're expecting the private sector to do it. Now, that's fine if the private sector thinks it has the necessary interest to do that. But the argument of the book is that often that is not the case, and the book is an attempt to figure out, well, why are there constraints in profitability that make it not necessarily a particularly attractive proposition to invest in building a new wind or solar farm? So that's why it's a problem, right? Is that governments are expecting the private sector to do this. So in a way, I'm from the left, but in a way, it's a funny thing writing and talking about this, because typically you're like, I don't want capitalists to make an enormous amount of profit. But you know what? When it comes to the energy transition, if governments are relying on the private sector, then I kind of do want them to make profits, because if they don't see the profits there, they're not going to do it. So, one of the things I often say is, well, what would I prefer? A rapid energy transition and the fat cats making obscene profits from driving that transition rapidly, or them not making money and the transition not happening. And I'm like, well, if that's the choice, which kind of is the choice, I prefer the former, even if it might kind of make me feel a bit queasy. And that's kind of where, ultimately, I prefer the governments were doing it themselves, but that ain't happening. Okay, so that's where we're kind of at politically at the moment.
We're not talking about technology. Technology is not the problem. It is the kind of the market and the financial instruments that are at play with renewable energies that's kind of causing all the issues with this. So now we've brought people up to speed. I kind of want to get into some of this a little bit. So it's something that, I think a lot of people on the left and have been I suppose annoyed about, is that over the 2010s we had some of the lowest and lowest interest rates ever in history. We're talking sometimes even negative interest rates, where the cost of borrowing was so low, and if you had a kind of active state that was going to roll out solar and own it, that would have been the best time to have done it. I think, being someone who was involved in Labour during Corbynism, the idea of we would have had such cheap funds to do that was kind of part of the promise of it. I'm kind of intrigued of what that effect was had in the private energy market during that time. There was lots of cheap debt knocking about. Was that supporting people or supporting companies to build out solar and build out wind, or were we seeing the problem of a lack of profits already rising its head even in the start of the 2010s?
And the answer is that, absolutely. Most of the development of solar and wind power, not just in the UK, but around the world, that has occurred historically, including in the 2010s, has been financed through debt, through borrowing. And obviously the fact that debt was cheap in that last decade through to about 2021 was very, very helpful. But profitability was already a problem in certain contexts. And all I would say is that now that interest rates have gone up a lot, it's simply become more of a problem, and it's become more evidently a problem than it was before. But it was always a problem. So let's talk about some of those kind of key reasons that I mentioned earlier. So I think the first thing I would say is say you're a hypothetical producer of electricity, whose business is to produce the stuff and sell it. Well, if you can produce electricity more cheaply, say by transitioning from producing it through coal or natural gas to producing it through solar or wind, and to be honest, that scenario doesn't actually happen very often, because you don't get many generators that do both, that are choosing between them. That's just not really how it works. You have companies that are natural gas producers, and then you have renewable specialists. So again, even that is a kind of a very great simplification of how the world works. But say you would think that, okay, I can shift to a cheaper generating source. Cool, I'm going to make more money by selling it. However, the reality is that any cost reductions that you are able to kind of achieve through shifting to the cheaper energy source, the question becomes, are you able to benefit from those cost reductions, or do you find yourself essentially compelled to pass those cost reductions on to your immediate customers and ultimately on to consumers? You see what I mean? And if you were able to capture those cost reductions yourself, great, you would shift, right? Because it makes economic sense to do so. But the reality is that in electricity markets and electricity industries as they're presently configured, it is actually in reality very, very hard for producers to capture those cost reductions. They typically find themselves economically compelled to pass those cost reductions on to those they sell the electricity to, and ultimately on to consumers. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that producers of any commodity, whatever the commodity is, typically only find themselves able to capture cost reductions if it's like an oligopolistic or monopolistic and industry structure. If it's a very, very competitive industry, which electricity generation typically is, competition essentially compel, and I'm using kind of Marx's language here. He talked about the coercive law of competition. And what he meant by that was that if you have a competitive industry, you as a producer find yourself compelled by that competition to pass those cost reductions on. And electricity generation, because of the nature of the market, because of the way in which electricity is sold, is very, very competitive. It gets sold into very competitive wholesale spot markets. And so those cost reductions get passed on, and that reduces the incentive drastically for those shift to lower cost generating sources to be adopted. The other thing, and again, this is very, very important to understand, is that the government subsidy mechanisms and support mechanisms exist around the world to encourage the private sector to shift towards renewables, right? So governments, I said earlier that governments have basically said to the private sector, it's up to you. That's only partly true. What they've said is it's up to you, but we will support you in doing that. We will provide kind of nudges of various kinds. We will provide incentives of various kinds to encourage you and to incentivize you to make that shift. Now, the key thing here is that in most parts of the world, including the UK, those support mechanisms, the way in which they are structured, they actually exacerbate those competitive pressures. They are structured in such a way that the industry, the competition among generators is exacerbated. The price competitions, they kind of bargain the price at which they sell the electricity down because of the nature of those subsidy mechanisms. So that's kind of the first big reason, is the inability for a producer to capture any cost advantages that come from lower cost generating sources like solar and wind.
Well, we'll get into a couple of examples of the kind of subsidy issues shortly, but just to kind of carry on with that point in terms of the level of competition in this sector, people will look at their energy bills and look at their consumption, see they have half-hourly meter readings. It is at that level this competition is happening, isn't it? That they'll get a generator will get I think the term is what's it called? Something, an energy signal. There's a kind of a phrase you use in the book to say, start generating at this time right now and tell us what price you'll do it at. And then they start generating.
It's super interesting how it works. Yeah. But basically what happens is that one day in advance of when electricity is actually being produced and sold, energy generators will bid into the spot market, and they'll say, we think, or in the case of a gas generator or a coal-based generator, we know that in that half hour, it's based on half-hour slots, but that half hour between kind of 3 and 3:30 p.m. tomorrow, we will be able to produce and put onto the grid this much electricity, and we are setting a particular bid price on that electricity. And so all the generators bid into the market for the next day. And then the grid operator, the national grid operator, at the same time has its estimates of how much demand there is going to be from consumers, from industry, and so on and so forth in that half hour. And so the grid operator's job is to match, the supply and demand have to match at all times. And on the day itself, there are obviously adjustments that need to be made because, solar and wind operators, for example, the wind might not be as strong as the wind generator said it was going to be or expected it was going to be, obviously things like that. And then demand might be higher or lower than it was expected to be. So there are adjustments that are made on the day. But basically, the market is configured a day in advance in terms of supply and demand. And the price of electricity for that half-hour slot is based upon all the bids and the pricing of those bids that come in and overall demand. And it's essentially a matching of supply and demand. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that's basically the way it works.
Free marketeers would think this is brilliant because it's like the closest to, like, it's the most the most, I don't know, in a time sense, the most purest form of a market you could ever have.
Absolutely.
Like literally every second, every half hour, every day is like a new market you can dive into.
It is. And mainstream economists love it.
Yeah.
But in a sense, consumers should love it. But and I don't want to we haven't got time to get into this, but it's fascinating. It's incredibly easy for certain generators and other actors that participate in this market to game the market, which is why you have, if you read the newspapers, periodically there'll be another scandal where a generator has gamed the market and the regulator slaps their wrist with a fine or tells them to stop doing what they're doing. So the market is incredibly far from foolproof. It gets gamed all the time. The other thing is that there are certain quirks of the system which mean that while this is in many ways a kind of a beautiful, kind of almost perfect market that should drive down prices for consumers, classical welfare gains, that there are reasons why it doesn't. And one of those, which kind of everyone heard about during the energy crisis in 2021-22, was that the price of natural gas has a disproportionately significant effect in markets like the UK's on the price of electricity. And as natural gas prices went up, particularly because of what was going on with Ukraine and Russia, electricity prices went up again as well. And we don't necessarily need to get into that.
Well, I think it's important just to say that, and tell me if I'm wrong here, that basically how it works is that the last unit of energy that gets used,
correct,
sets the price of all the rest of the energy that comes after.
Correct.
So, and usually,
which is really interesting and a bit strange, but that's the way it works.
Exactly. So usually that means you turn on a gas plant when you need it in that pinch, so it ends up being the last unit of energy always used. So then you end up having a higher inflated. That's where you get that inflated influence of the price of gas kind of in the whole system. Which
you do, and it's why electricity prices in the wholesale market can be extraordinarily volatile. Put it like this: so if between 2 and 2:30 on a particular day, as you said at the outset, all the power in the UK has been provided by renewables. Their bid price tends to be very, very low. Let's say it's 15 pounds per megawatt hour, for example. Then that's the price in the wholesale market because they are supplying all the power. Now imagine that the wind drops a little bit or demand goes up a little bit or both of those things. And in the next half hour slot, wind and solar, who are saying bidding on average 15 pounds per megawatt hour, can only supply 99% of the energy, of the electricity. And that 1%, the final 1%, has to be provided by gas. Now let's also assume that Russia has just invaded Ukraine and that Russia's gas supplies have been cut off. And suddenly the price of natural gas, the price that natural gas operators, because their fuel costs have gone up, are bidding is not, say, 50 pounds per megawatt hour, but 500 pounds per megawatt hour. Then for that half hour, the price of electricity, for all electricity, including that supplied by the renewables generators, will be 500 pounds per megawatt hour because it's the last unit supplied that dictates the price. So suddenly, in one moment, from one half hour to the next, you've gone from the price of all electricity being from 15 pounds per megawatt hour to 500 pounds per megawatt hour. That's not a hypothetical scenario. That happened, that happened. And so, and again, that's why politicians and stakeholders during the crisis say, we have to uncouple electricity and gas prices. You'll have read about decoupling or uncoupling in the papers. But all that talk's disappeared since then.
Because the price has gone back down.
For all sorts of very, very interesting reasons. Well, that's one reason. It's not the only reason. I think another reason is that simply that most politicians and most of their advisors do not understand electricity markets and energy markets. They really, really don't.
That's worrying.
It's wild,
isn't it? to say the least. That you would hope maybe the energy minister might have a rough idea of how an energy market operates, but
you would think so, and you would hope so.
But
actually, I mean, we have proof that they don't, which is that when they sort of realized they needed to intervene during the energy crisis, they came up with all sorts of and publicly spoke about all different ideas they had for how they could do that. But actually, lots of them they had to kind of backtrack once they got told how the market actually worked. They were like, we can't actually do what we thought we were going to do because the market doesn't work like we thought it should or does. Anyway, that's another point.
More,
no, the level of understanding is generally very, very small.
Yeah.
So I wanted to, if I can, I wanted to carry on about some of the other because
please do.
I think this is the nub of the matter. So one is this issue that your costs go down, but you don't necessarily benefit from that as an energy producer. And again, remember what I said at the beginning. In the old days, producers and distributors of energy were the same company. Typically now they're not. That really matters when it comes to the incentives associated with the different costs of generating sources. So that's the first one. The second one is that, and actually this is quite good actually, because this connects directly to what we were just saying about volatile electricity prices. So let's assume this kind of hypothetical scenario where, or let's put it like this: say you have two electricity producers, one that is generating all its electricity through natural gas or coal. The other one is generating it all through wind or solar. Now, and let's assume that both of those generators can produce exactly the same amount of electricity over exactly the same period of, say, a week, for example. You would assume, would you not, that if that's the case, the one that has the lower generating costs would be the more profitable because they're producing exactly the same amount of product over exactly the same period. That assumption is not necessarily true and can actually be completely wrong. And the reason for that is that they can and almost certainly will be producing and indeed selling electricity of very, very different market values. So as I said earlier, electricity the prices at where electricity is sold are very, very
surely
volatile.
The quality of electricity is the same.
It's exactly the same thing.
So how can they have different market prices?
because within that week, and in fact over any particular time frame you care to look at, those two electricity producers will be producing electrical output with very, very different temporal profiles. So one might be producing their power at times of the day or at times of the day or week when electricity is very, very expensive. The other one might be producing and selling their power at times of the day or week when electricity is very, very cheap. And so if the reality here is that if you look at when electrical generators of different types using different sources of different methods of energy generation are producing that electrical power, they do tend to produce electricity of very, very different revenue potential because they are producing at different times of the day. So it's completely wrong to simply assume that because they're producing the same thing, electricity, that product has exactly the same revenue potential, irrespective of the generating source, because it's simply not true. Some could be producing extremely valuable electricity, i.e. electricity produced at times of the day or week or year when electricity is very marketable and very, very scarce and very, very expensive. That tends to be natural gas and coal-fired or nuclear generators. And others will be producing it when it's very, very cheap. Tends to be solar solar and wind-based generators. Excuse me. So that's the second reason. So we think that, you know, they have different costs, but they're producing the same thing, more profit here, less profit there. It just doesn't work like that. You have to get into the weeds.
So it's less about quantity and more about timing, really.
Exactly.
You know, which is kind of not the way that I think most kind of, well, I suppose even Marxists would think about kind of commodities. It's not about you can make something very small and valuable. It's about when you can deploy it into the market.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So electricity, again, people like to say, electricity is electricity is electricity. It's all the same thing. It's not the same thing. When it is produced makes a massive difference. The profile with which you are producing that electrical power really matters. That's a temporal issue. And actually, that's a very nice say. It's very, very convenient. Because it also
like you
matters.
planned a book around this, Brett.
No, not at all. But it also really matters. So not only does electricity have a history, have a temporality that is very, very material and fundamental, it also has a geography. It also has a spatiality. And of course, you might say, well, you would say that as a geographer, but it really, really does. And in a way, I think this is kind of the most fascinating issue of all. The third issue that I want to talk about, which is the geography of electricity production, and it's hugely, hugely important, and often gets ignored. But electricity. So electricity is not just electricity in the sense that it has a temporality; it also has a spatiality. It really matters in economic and engineering terms where electricity is produced. So again, let's go back to our two hypothetical generators: the solar or wind generator and the natural gas or coal generator. Again, same simple scenario. One has lower generating cost than the other, ergo should be making more profit. Well, even if we leave aside the factors I've already talked about in terms of your ability to capture as a producer those cost reductions, and the kind of the different marketability, the different revenue potential of those different types of electricity you're producing, let's assume all that is equal. It's still not necessarily the case that the renewables developer will be more profitable because its costs are not only generating costs.
Yeah.
So if you are an electrical power producer, your one of your main costs is how much it costs to produce that power.
Yeah.
But you also entail costs involved in the delivery of that power to where it is consumed. You have transmission costs that you are charged by the national grid, and those charges, again, enormously complicated equations that are involved here in this charging system. But one of the things that significantly affects that charging system is where you are based. Now, here's the thing. On average, it costs a lot more to distribute power generated by solar and wind generators to where it is needed than it costs to distribute power generated by conventional power plants. Simple reason for that. Conventional power plants are, on average, much more closely located to where the centers of power demand in a country are. Let's take and vice versa. Solar and wind generators are, on average, much more closely located, much further located,
much more rurally located,
from where the centers of power demand are. And the UK is a classic case of this, but it's true of every country in the world you care to look at. You get exactly the same pattern, whether it's China, Germany, Brazil, Sweden, where I live. But let's take the UK. Centers of power demand predominantly in the southeast, obviously not only there, but that the center of gravity is towards the south and the east of the country. Where are essentially all the wind power? It's in the north of the country. It's in Scotland. Yeah. Now, obviously, that is an economic decision. Think about this. Why are wind developers predominantly located there? Well, if you think about the costs that go into the equation of generating that power, probably one of your main costs, if not your main cost, buying the turbines and installing them is very expensive, of course. But obviously, land, territory is a hugely significant cost for a renewables developer. These things take up an enormous amount of space, whether it's onshore or offshore.
You say there's a wind farm in Illinois that's 34,000 acres of land just to produce 30 megawatts of electricity, which is not a huge amount of electricity for a
huge space
supplier.
required. So as a developer, you need to either buy or lease that land. If it's onshore, it works a bit differently. Offshore, of course, you have offshore leases of seabed typically, but onshore, you have a significant amount of your cost is buying or leasing that land. As a wind developer, you're not going to be building a wind farm next to Heathrow or in the southeast. You're going to be building it where land is cheapest.
Yeah,
that's the equation for you, and this is the thing that people so often forget when they talk about, wind has incredibly low generating costs. Well, it does, because wind generators are predominantly located where land is cheap. But there's no free lunch, right? You can predominantly locate where land is cheap, and that means your generating costs are lower than natural gas producers, fine. But your delivery costs are much, much higher precisely because you're locating where land is cheap. That's how markets work, right?
Yeah.
There's a reason the land is cheap, and that's because people don't live there.
Yeah.
But obviously, if people don't live there, there's no electricity demand there. And so focusing on generating costs in isolation, which almost everyone does when they talk about electricity and the cheapness of renewables, is completely erroneous, because their delivery costs are much, much higher. Now, I'll make a quick caveat here, which is that it's not really a caveat. It's a kind of a complexity that people shouldn't forget about. And the point is simply this: which is that the institutions that design and regulate and manage the electricity system try to require electricity generators to bear the full costs of their locational decisions, by which I mean, if a wind farm developer decides to set up its wind farm in the Hebrides, which obviously entails hugely disproportionately high costs in terms of that electricity being delivered to where it's required, the way that things like transmission charges are structured attempt to mean that those wind farm developers pay a cost in their transmission charges for locating there. In reality, they do not bear the full cost. And the reason you can see that is because they continue to locate there. The transmission charges try to incentivize them to locate themselves closer to where demand is to where demand is concentrated, but they're still not doing that, precisely because they're not incurring the full charges. Some of those incremental charges are being borne by other participants in the electricity value chain, including households, transmission operators themselves, distribution companies, retailers, and so on. But they're being charged a significant proportion of those. And here's the other thing. And again, anyone who reads about regulation of the electricity system, attempts to restructure the electricity market, will know something about this. But one other way that lots of other countries around the world have attempted to deal with this kind of problem is to say, not only are we going to charge you more for kind of setting up your wind farm back and beyond where people are living, the pricing of electricity, the amount that you can earn from selling your electricity, we will vary that geographically. So that's how it works in Sweden, where I live, for example. So there are 4 electricity, I don't want to get into the detail too much, but it's very, very important. There are 4 electricity pricing regions in Sweden. And in the north of Sweden, the price of electricity is generally much, much lower than in the south of Sweden. And what that means is that in the north of Sweden, where land is very, very cheap, wind farm developers earn less for generating their power than they do in the south of electricity, where land is much, much more expensive. And the reason that it works that way is precisely another way of trying to incentivize more quote unquote rational locational decisions, to get the developers to base themselves closer to where the demand for electricity is concentrated. UK doesn't do that. There's a national wholesale market.
I mean, it's kind of fascinating and grim, actually, in a really significant way. I think if trying to imagine the possibility of a kind of eco-socialism, it becomes difficult when you describe
it is and it isn't, right? But it's incredibly complicated and weird and problematic for the energy transition, but only because it's been made that way. It's been made that way. Like it used to, as I said, it used to be really quite simple. You had one entity, publicly owned, that just did everything.
Yeah.
And it wasn't perfect, but it kind of worked. And actually, if we'd maintained that system, transitioning to renewables would have been far, far more straightforward and simple than when this ridiculously complex system now that policymakers have kind of created over time, but which they increasingly don't really understand, and where the incentives are such that the faster transition to renewables is anything but required. And instead, governments have to use this kind of panoply of complex subsidy mechanism and support mechanisms to try to incentivize something that would have been completely straightforward if that system had been maintained in the first place. And the reason I say that's encouraging as well as problematic is that there's nothing in principle to stop reversion to that type of system. You could simply nationalize the energy sector. I guess I say simply, it wouldn't be simple politically, but administratively and logistically, it probably wouldn't be that difficult. And then you can have a kind of a central planner, for want of a better word, that can kind of have all those interlocking pieces together and fit them together in a way where right now they're just not fitting together, precisely because they've been torn asunder.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy the situation you described.
It's utterly crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that privatization of utilities in the UK, which has obviously gone further in the UK than most parts of the world, has proven to be pretty disastrous across the board. I would say telecoms is probably the main exception you could make to that. But electricity, alongside maybe water, I would argue is clearly the one that's been proven to be most disastrous of all. And I think it's not only kind of silly lefties like me that would say that. You read the FT these days, and there's pretty much no one writing in the FT that is not super critical of energy and water privatization as it has been affected and managed in the UK. So even people who are broadly supportive of markets and capitalism and so on themselves would say, no, it's been a disaster.
This hasn't worked. Yeah.
I suppose the other thing that I'd like you to sort of talk a little bit about the kind of significance of what's happening in India and China in terms of energy consumption and sort of dirty energy, really, and reliance on sort of fossil fuels and so on, because I think that's quite important sort of from a global perspective, isn't it? So it would be good if you could sort of say something about that, I think.
Yeah. Fantastic question, because not only is it important from a global perspective, it's kind of all important from a global perspective. We have, those of us based in Europe and North America, spend a lot of our time, for good reasons, focusing on and thinking about energy transitions and the obstacles to those transitions in those parts of in these parts of the world, in Europe and the Northwest and North America, sorry. But the reality, for better or worse, and you might think it's for better, you might think it's for worse, is that what happens from now on in terms of the energy transition in North America and Europe is almost by the by from a global
perspective. It's a small part of the puzzle.
Well, it's three things actually combined. So one is that we are a relatively small part of the puzzle, just in sheer kind of demographic terms. That's definitely one part of it. But there are two other parts to it as well. So the second one, and it's one that Lucy's already alluded to, is that we like to be, obviously we are and should be very self-critical about how the energy transition has or hasn't happened in Europe and North America. But actually, as you said earlier, in the UK, we've gone quite far. I mean, given our capacity and given the wealth of the country, we should have obviously gone a lot further. And especially given what we knew about climate change when we knew it, we don't really know anything much more today than we already knew in the early 80s. So it's absurd that it's taken as long as it has. But already in terms of electricity generation, Europe and North America have gone quite far in those terms. But as Lucy said, there are other parts of the world, very, very populous parts of the world, where power generation is still far more reliant on fossil fuels than it is in Europe and in North America. You can look at places like South Africa, where I think over 90% of power generation is still based on coal. India is about 75%. China's about 65% still. And so in terms of, if you're thinking about impacts on future emissions growth, because of their continuing high dependence on fossil fuels for energy, for power generation, for electricity generation, what happens there will be disproportionately significant because of that ongoing existing reliance on fossil fuels. That's the second reason. And the third reason, and again, all of these are connected, but the third incredibly important reason is that is where the bulk of future growth in energy demand in general and electricity demand in particular is expected to take place. So if you look at North America and Europe, I mean, electricity demand's hardly been growing in recent decades, in the last couple of decades. Populations are broadly flat. We were already very significant consumers of energy. We've all had electricity for, as long as we can remember. And so energy demand hasn't really been rising. Electricity demand will continue to grow. It will continue to grow because we are electrifying things like transportation and heating and buildings and so on. But it won't grow at anything like the rate at which it will grow in places like China and India and Nigeria and Indonesia and South Africa and so on, where there are hundreds of millions of households just getting access to electricity for the first time, and where per capita consumption of energy and electricity is still fractions of the level of what it is in the West. And so because that's where the lion's share of future demand growth will come in future, that is where it matters how that future demand is supplied, whether it continues to be through fossil fuels or whether it's through renewables. So if you put those three reasons together, then absolutely what happens in the West is almost neither here nor there in terms of the future profile of emissions generation from energy production, from electricity production.
Now, I think
that's where it really matters.
Yeah, I think on that note, Brett, we're going to have to kind of round up the conversation there. I know there's so much more to discuss on this, and we'll happily have you back on when maybe you write the prices wrong again or something in the future. Thank you so much for your time today. It's absolutely it's a bit mind-boggling, and
it's been amazing actually. Conversation in the sense that it's often we often talk about this in such kind of broad ways when we think about what a transition is, but actually understanding, I think, the obstacles is, and the complexity of that is, and the unevenness.
So
many assumptions.
If I can just, one final comment, one final point, one very quick final point on that. If I had to emphasize one thing when you mention obstacles, it's this, which is that there has increasingly been this widespread assumption and claim that yes, there are obstacles that remain, but the obstacles that remain are solely kind of political or bureaucratic. It's it's all about speeding up the permissions process for the development of renewables and so on. Those are the obstacles, and the economics has been solved because the price of the generation from these technologies has come down. My argument in the book is, of course, those other obstacles are important, but hang on a second, there is still a massive economic obstacle, and it's to do with profitability, not price.
Amazing. Wow. Right, so it's come to the part of the show where we like to give a bit of praise and a bit of love to someone who's doing great work. it's the shout out. Now, Brett, who do you have in mind this week?
I want to point not to an individual, but to an organisation. So for obviously, I've become obsessed with, probably not too strong a word, energy and climate and the economics of energy and climate in the recent years while working on this book. And there's a great journalistic organisation called Heat Map News, based in the US, which I think is doing really good. They're quite new. They've only been around for about a year, but in my view, they're doing some of the best journalistic work in terms of investigative journalism around precisely these sorts of issues. So I'd encourage people to check them out.
Fantastic. Brilliant. And we'll share some links for that in the show notes. Energy system, guys, it's very complicated, but we can fix it, like all our problems. And we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.